Thank you.
And we're all.
Press got it on my screen. You press got it, I guess.
Oh, yeah, it's just giving you an alert.
Trying to get my mouse for this.
Good.
Or was it tap? Yeah, you told me that last time.
Yeah, your mouse pad.
I pressed.
Kind of finicky. Yeah. We have 2 attendees.
Yeah, well, it's something. I think one of them is Judith and one is me, probably.
Yeah. Okay. You can have all sorts of. It's unique for posterity. Yes. Will be the next, right, and then people who come and learn something new. And get a nice summary of what you did. I love it. I think that, well, it's so relevant. Really deals with, yeah.
I had it muted. Sorry.
Yeah, for those of you joining on Zoom, welcome, get comfortable. We should be starting just a little bit after 3 o'clock. But do look at your Zoom screen and find the Q&A tab at the top or the bottom, and that's where you can enter questions at any time. And a shout out to Dorothy Gallo, and hope you're doing well. We see that you signed into Zoom. You are a trooper. We miss you. Get better soon. Bye. For those of you on Zoom, it's now 3 o'clock. We should be starting fairly soon. We still have some people streaming into the museum here, so we'll let them get seated first. Just a reminder for those of you on Zoom, if you find the QA feature on your Zoom screen, either top or bottom, that's where you can enter questions at any time during the program, and we will get to them at the end. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to turn this over to Max Nosbich before I fully introduce myself in the program. Max?
Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining the Hingham Historical Society for today's lecture. My name is Max Nosbich, and I serve as the Manager of Education here at the Hingham Historical Society. Today's lecture is entitled An Evolving American Dream, and it's the final presentation in our 2023-2024 lecture series entitled Suburbia, the American Dream. So today I'm excited because we're going to be wrapping up what has been a fascinating lecture series. And it's bittersweet. I'm excited to hear what their speakers have to say today, but I'm also sad it's ending. It's been a terrific lecture. We've had some gorgeous days here in Hingham the past couple of days, thankfully. And thanks for all for being here on another gorgeous day. So time is flying, and May is a big month for us at the Hingham Historical Society. This May 4th, we're hosting a Benjamin Lincoln House open house that will be free and open to the public. People can just walk on in and get a free tour of the Benjamin Lincoln House. And this month, we're really going to be kicking off that house. It's open to the public now, but we're really honoring that in the next few weeks. And I like to say the Benjamin Lincoln House is Massachusetts' newest, oldest house museum. So this is going to be a big day for us. So spread the word, come on out, bring friends, bring family, and come visit the Benjamin Lincoln House this coming weekend on May 4th. And the Saturday after that, in 2 weeks, that's where then we're going to have our Benjamin Lincoln House opening celebration. So if you attend our tavern night here at the Hingham Historical Society, we know how to throw a party. And so this is going to be no exception. We're going to be officially celebrating the Benjamin Lincoln House with speeches, fifes and drums, right? Are there going to be fife and drums? Good. Fife and drums, cocktails, quill pens, and so much more. And tickets are on sale for that on our website. We only have a couple spaces left. So we hope you'll join us on May 11th for that. And then the weekend after that, one weekend after another, again, I said May is busy. On Saturday, May 18th, we have our annual Springham event. And this is a fun, free, and laid-back afternoon concert with beers you can buy as well. So it's a fun day to relax, enjoy the Hingham Historical Society, enjoy this beautiful weather we've been having, and just hang out with your friends here in our beautiful space. And so it's a jeans and a t-shirt type event. So who doesn't love that, especially this time of year? And then the very next day, the Sunday after Springham, we are commemorating the 249th anniversary of the Battle of Grape Island, as we like to call it, the second battle of the American Revolution. So you're going to want to relive the drama and the action of that fateful May Day back in 1775 with us at Hingham Bathing Beach on Sunday, May 19th. You'll see the Patriots take the field, the reenactors, they'll be going up against their classic adversary, the British regulars. So you'll want to see that. That event is also free and open to the public, and it's at Hingham Bathing Beach. And if you have children, it's a great event for children. And lastly, I want to just emphasize that we are open for regular tours Tuesday through Saturday. So come on and take a tour of the Old Ordinary. the Benjamin Lincoln House, take a cart tour when the weather's nice, a walking tour, or take a tour of this building. If you haven't taken a tour of this building, you can see it in a whole new perspective when you take a tour on it. And before we officially begin, before I hand it back to Eileen, I want to remind everyone to stick around afterwards because I'll be announcing our new and exciting 2024-2025 Hingham Historical Society lecture series starting this September. We're very excited for it. We'll also be offering a free promotion for all of you, so you'll definitely want to get in on that. So I'll hand it back over to Eileen, but I just want to tease that afterwards we'll be announcing that, so stick around. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. My name is Eileen McIntyre, and it has been my real honor and pleasure to chair the Education Committee for the last several years and bring you 5 interesting lecture series, this one being particularly interesting at this time for our community, for our nation. So let's get started. We're calling today's lecture An Evolving American Dream. And I think if you've been to some of the other lectures, you've seen that this has been suburbs and suburbia has been evolving for about 2 centuries. So it's continuing to evolve. I'm going to begin by introducing my friend and colleague on the Education Committee, Ruth Gilbert-Whitner, because she's going to be bringing you some new information today, some fascinating data. So Ruth, I thought she was retired, but she actually, having been, she's retired as a school superintendent, but is a very busy person as an educational consultant and coach for new school superintendents. She is a former school superintendent, but before that, an administrator of curriculum and instruction, a coordinator and teacher of gifted and talented programs, and much more in her educational career. And hats off to all teachers, but Ruth, I really appreciate all you've done for all the students that have been impacted by the work you've done. Ruth got her doctorate in educational leadership from the University of Massachusetts. Here's how we've organized today, and Ruth and I have worked on this together. You may have seen in the brochure, originally we were going to do a program in March that Ruth was part of with this data set. And when that external speaker was unable to join us because of family issues, we decided to rethink this as a final program where we could bring back some of the key findings, the takeaways from the lectures that we've had thus far. So I'm going to begin with key takeaways from first the 4 of the 6 programs that preceded this, which really dealt with how we got to where we are today, or the history of US suburbs. Then Ruth is going to take us through some really fascinating data and analysis from a product called the Great Real Estate Reset, research and analysis that was done by the Brookings Institute. Then I'll come back, because of the data you will have heard, I think the next program from our preceding series, the 5th program, is particularly relevant to some of the things that Ruth will talk about in terms of retrofitting suburbs, and the 6th program as well. So that's where I'll finish up the findings, the key takeaways from our series thus far. And then we'll get into a discussion, briefly, Ruth and I, and then we really invite the audience, both here at the museum and those on Zoom, to join the conversation about what we've learned and interesting facets of it. So here's the faculty that we brought to you this year. And I have to say it was interesting to pull them all together, but I think they all fed on each other, and one often led into another or underscored a point made by another one. So here they all are, and I'm going to do the first 4 first in terms of key takeaways. Here are the topics that we covered in terms of history, just broadly speaking. We first learned about suburbs as a defining characteristic of the US, which I hadn't ever thought of that way before. We looked at the 19th, 20th century history leading into today's suburban landscape, key factors in Boston and Hingham's suburban development. And then in the last few lectures, we talked about 21st century challenges, how suburbs can be retrofitted, and the importance of suburbs in shaping national politics. So we began with Ken Jackson, who, some of our other speakers said he kind of wrote the book, opened the door to suburban studies. But that was a book written in 1985. He said when he began, he had to first think, well, what is a suburb? Because the US Census gives no definition. And this is the definition he used as he did his deep research. Single-family detached homes, resident-owned, yards and lawns that he underscored are huge by global standards, and tied to a journey to work. So that's, as he was finishing his book in 1985. That was his definition, pretty much still stands today. And then he went through the history going back more than 200 years, beginning in 1815. And that period, 1815, 1875, it was really transportation that pushed people out of the cities, the opportunity to live in additional housing because the streetcar could take you there, and then the rail can take you there. Then he looked at the late 19th, early 20th century, when people really felt the need to escape from the cities because of the urban industrial pollution. Immigrants, the Irish initially, people wanted to get away from, and that was pushing people out. And then 1920s and 1940s, the importance of the automobile and basically American adoption of the automobile. He made a point of, it was a German who came up with the original automobile, but Henry Ford made automobile ownership achievable in terms of the economics of scale. And by 1929, half of all the cars in the world were Fords, and 85% of them were owned by Americans. Now people had their own vehicle to get out to suburbia. And then he talked about the mid-20th century when there was a need for job creation and housing following years of depression and World War II. Then there was the baby boom and, of course, white flight. A whole area that I hadn't given thought about because I didn't know anything about it was the technology of home building and how that impacted the affordability of homes in the suburbs. He talked about balloon frame construction, really was a result of the Industrial Revolution, that you had standardized materials, the lumber as well as the machined nails. And then you could get plans from Ladies' Home Journal, and you could get kits from Sears. It made it achievable for the middle class to imagine owning a home. The 1940s, he talked about federal policies, very important, and we heard this from other lecturers as well. It made ownership widely achievable through the way the federal government was giving you economic incentives, but redlining was built in. So FHA mortgages, tax deductions for real estate tax and mortgage interest, but white only need apply, really. I mean, it was a federally baked in policy for many of the subdivisions that were being built after World War II. The romantic suburbs we began to hear about from Ken and heard from in later lectures as well. The early to mid 20th century, one aspect was women as homemakers really being idealized in women's lifestyle publications, and then later in TV sitcoms. The gated communities that emerged with curved roads, like Llewellyn Park in New Jersey, built from scratch. Another one, Riverside, Illinois, that we heard about, but that being kind of the ideal, that you'd have these kind of pastoral settings. The importance of Frederick Law Olmsted is not only because of those pastoral settings that he was often part of as a designer, but he made the argument, the economic argument, that open space increases the value of the real estate adjacent to it. And he based that on his experience with Central Park in Manhattan, where all those apartment buildings next to Central Park went up in value because of being near a park like that. So Ken ended by saying, we've built a system and a culture that favors suburbs. There has been a cost to that. Legacy of racism, fossil fuel impact on the environment, social isolation that's really inherent in the footprint of automobile suburbs, people driving home into their garage, going through the carport, into their house, as opposed to sitting out on the porch or walking along the front walk. So things have changed from the way people used to live. But he said the ideals of new urbanism, they have merit. Change, he thought, would come slowly. In large part, he said, because we are so decentralized as a country. And he talked about education specifically. And that was fascinating to me that, we're kind of used to everyone having their own school board and school committee and making decisions. And yeah, there's some oversight from the state and federal government, but basically you can kind of decide how things are going to go. He said, you go to Europe and everyone's on the same page of the textbook all across the country because it's not decentralized. So he said, governments being decentralized, making decisions at the local level, there's some good aspects to that, but it does make change harder. And then he talked about just the built infrastructure, that's costly to change. So then we moved into Francesca Ammon, who took on this fascinating research, I think when she was still in grad school, about the importance of earth-moving technology companies the machinery that they developed, and the culture associated with that kind of clearance coming out of World War II. So while many industries had to shift their focus during the war to help with the war effort, companies like Caterpillar and others in the earth-moving business actually got to continue developing their technology. And so there were major advances in technology. They were also training people. The CBs, the construction battalions, they were first called, were learning how to use this equipment. And basically it was a rehearsal of large-scale clearance that would come after the war. That culture of clearance, she said, really started to take hold because of what had happened in Europe. The bombs that had obliterated cities that needed to be rebuilt. They had to be cleaned first, so they were cleared with this bulldozer equipment, and that made it a positive. This, you'd think knocking things down could be a negative, but it made it a positive because they were cleaning up Europe. And so this attitude came home, and she said really militarized the American landscape, that there was this great delight in before and after pictures, going in and clearing out neighborhoods in the inner city, either for new construction or for a highway that was going to come through. And so it became it really fueled that process of creating the roadways and the suburbs through rapid clearance of the land. The post-war equipment training, she said they needed more than the CBs who had already been trained, really was for white men, that people of color were still relegated to manual pick and shovel work. Women who had been so important during the war, manning factories, et cetera, were also excluded from that training. But they did, create a cohort of people with the training to go across the country and do this kind of clearance work. Then she talked about Bill Levitt, who we would hear about in, we heard a little bit about from Ken Jackson, that he had actually gotten his laboratory experience, if you will, as a CB in the Pacific during World War II. And he learned these mass production techniques from putting up, military camps, and came back and created Levittown, a self-contained community built from scratch, what had been potato farmland. So then we moved into Jim O'Connell. So we had a lot of background now about how suburbs came to be, and had taken a long time. And Jim then focused in on what was actually happening in the greater Boston area. One of the things that I took away that was news to me is Boston, compared to other cities around the country, is a much smaller central city. And there's a reason for that many cities around the country, as they wanted to get economies of scale, would annex the early suburbs. So those streetcar suburbs then became part of the city. And that happened in Boston with Dorchester, Roxbury. You see a list of them here. But then it stopped because there were a lot of older communities in this area, Brookline being notable because they really pushed back hard, but also Cambridge, who had their own identity and didn't want to be part of the city of Boston. And so they pushed back, and annexation basically then stopped after 1912. So Boston stayed pretty small as a central city. But transportation, as we'd heard earlier, streetcars to rail and then automobile fueled where and how suburbs were built. And he talked about the appeal of late 19th, early 20th century suburbs for the same reasons that Ken had talked about. But in addition to Frederick Law Olmsted, he also talked about Charles Eliot and his impact on how suburbs were being designed, the importance of open space. Then he talked about, these suburbs that said, no, I don't want to be part of the city. They realized that they needed some economies of scale. And so suburbs started to band together to create organizations or institutions that would help them with key things that they needed to afford, water or sewer systems, things like that. So the Metropolitan Water Commission, which became the MWRA, and to conserve open space, what's now known as the MDC, was created. That's where suburbs were getting together. So they weren't part of the city, but they still needed those economies of scale. He talked about the development in Boston that there was at a certain point there was pushback because the immigrants that people were trying to get away from were now moving out into the suburbs, and the triple deckers were being built, and people started to get concerned about that, and that resulted in the 1912 land use regulations, the Tenement House Act, and the end of triple deckers being built. You can still see those wonderful triple deckers close into Boston around Dorchester, but they didn't spread beyond that. So after 1930, no triple deckers. Then zoning, the enabling legislation that allowed for zoning in Massachusetts was passed in 1920. By 1928, 28 of the metropolitan areas had adopted it. Hingham, as we later learned also from Gordon Carr, would be quite late to the party on zoning. And then he talked about some highways that really spurred development outside of Boston, where initially people thought, oh, what are we doing? You know, why do we need Route 128? It was called the Road to Nowhere initially. Then it became this tech corridor. Southeast Expressway, same thing. People thought, you know, why do we need this highway? And then, you know, now, you know, the number of cars on the Southeast Expressway is a real concern. So people took to it, the highways, and moved further out in the suburbs. So sprawl, outer suburbs, office parks, and tech corridors. Manufacturing now moved out of the urban core because those highways were good for trucks too, and warehouses. And so where it used to have factories that would be multi-story, they could spread out in the suburbs. They could have their warehouses, they could have distribution network tied to the highway network. And then he talked about shopping plazas, which then morphed into big box centers later and auto-dependent strips. And that's the area where we hear in a later lecture that the retrofitting is starting to happen because those shopping plazas are no longer as popular as they once were. So he ended by talking about what's happening now, like late 20th century, early 21st century, that Boston actually is a leader as a post-industrial city. He talked about the knowledge economy, Kendall Square, the seaport, and that the city is trying to remedy past missteps by putting the central artery underground. But he said we're grappling with population growth and housing shortages. So he talked about the types of solutions that suburbs have been looking at since the 1990s. He talked about Marina Bay in Quincy, industrial site to multi-use development. Residential above retail for the first time since 1920 in Canton. Transit-linked development, Station Landing in Medford, later Hingham Shipyard, transit-linked and industrial use being changed to multi-use. And then very recently, 2021, Massachusetts Housing Choice Law, local option to zone for ADUs. We've gone through that decision-making in Hingham already, and the MBTA Communities Law, enabling by right multifamily development near transit. And we just had a town meeting about that this week. So brought it very close to home. Then we turned to Gordon Carr and got focused on Hingham. Now, Hingham was kind of a self-contained entity for a long time, since its founding in 1635. And we certainly had contact with Boston and the world beyond through trade, but people worked here in Hingham. There was, you know, crafts and industry and fishing and you know, all kinds of work that went on right in our town. So 1860 to 1910, smallest population growth in Metro Boston, Hingham. 1923, there was a planning board approved, but didn't have much clout. 1933, he made the point that Hingham still had, in 1933, 25 dairy farms and 17 poultry farms. So we still had that rural agricultural aspect to our town as well. But 1940 is where things really started to change here. The Hingham shipyard made a difference because housing was needed adjacent to the shipyard for the people who worked there, for the military who were coming to town. And the Bradley Woods subdivision was the first kind of classic subdivision built in Hingham from scratch that got people's attention. And the very next year, we approved zoning. No surprise. So this, I just did some screen captures from Gordon's presentation, so they're not as beautiful as his original slides, but he ticked off 1941 to 1948, we had 10 new subdivisions, far outpacing towns around. We were kind of catching up. 1959, Route 3 got extended from Derby Street to the Southeast Expressway, and commuter rail ended, so there was kind of plus and minus in terms of the attractiveness of a place like Hingham at that point. 75, we got the commuter ferry, and 2007 commuter rail was reintroduced. So if you look at this screen capture I did, the green line shows where population growth is going up in Hingham. And you see after 1940, those 10 subdivisions, a lot of population growth there. And then after 2000, there was a little slowdown there during a recession period, but it's kind of off the charts again. And some of that is the senior housing that's come into town, Linden Ponds, but also all the development at the shipyard as well. So then he talked about looking forward. Master plan was the 2035 projections for our town, where not unlike other suburbs, the population that's growing are seniors. And he made the point 24% will be over 75 years old, according to the projections for 2035. But there'll be a lot of young people too, under 19 years old, 23%. Both of those population groups need a lot of attention, whether it's education or walkable neighborhoods, healthcare, all kinds of support that seniors need. So those are things for us to be mindful of. And then he shared the citizen input that went into the master planning process. What I found interesting when I went back and looked at this, it really echoes some of what we heard about from a future lecture, which was about retrofitting suburbs and the key challenges and issues. So the citizen input, you see it all here, that we want to preserve our character, but deal with things like climate change and traffic, supporting a resilient economy, all of those things that are driving change in many suburbs around the country. So I'm now going to turn this over to Ruth Gilbert-Whitner, and thank you so much, Ruth, for all the work you've done to prepare for this.
Hey, thank you, Eileen. And so we're now going to look at the Great Real Estate Reset. And this is a report we were initially going to look at on March 10th with Chris Marsh. And unfortunately, Chris couldn't be with us, but I do want to tell you a little bit about her because she might be someone you might want to follow up on. The reason we were going to talk with her is that she has written a book based on her research called The Love Jones Cohort. And she was really looking primarily at middle-class Black families, but primarily those who are single. And that was going to fit into the report. So originally I was going to talk a lot about modernizing family. But what we've decided to do today is really give you the full report, sort of digest that based on what you've heard from Eileen, recapping the first lectures. And then as we look forward to where we are today and where we're going to move forward in the future. So this report that we're looking at was put together by the Brookings Institution, and the Brookings Institution has been around for over 100 years. Founded in 1916, it's based in Washington, D.C., and their purpose is to do nonpartisan research on areas that really impact governance, policy, locally, nationally, and globally. And I'd always known about them, but I wanted to know more. And if you do want to know more about what they do, I was really curious. You can go on the website, and much of their work has really informed a lot of the events that have happened in the 20th century and even the 21st century. They were very important in the development of the master plan, of the Marshall Plan, for example. So interesting work they've done. So this report was put together really looking at where we are in the 21st century in terms of what we build in America, where we live, and also how we are changing. And you've heard the real buildup of that and what Eileen has been talking to you about. This was also put together by Locus. And the word locus, as you may know from Latin, if you took that way back in high school, means place. And this is an organization of research developers who are really committed to sustainable communities and housing. So they worked with the Brookings Institution to put this together. The entire focus is not suburbia, but please take that as your context as you're looking at this. And I think you're going to find it to be very insightful in terms of what we're talking about. So one of the things that we know is that at the beginning of the 20th century, the concept of Americans owning their own homes began to develop. And clearly, as you've heard from the lectures, that really began with the look of suburbia back in the building of suburbia in the 19th century. But by the early 20th century, people really saw home ownership as very important. Now, when we're talking about the populations that time, we're really talking about white Americans and not people of color. But that was what was happening at the beginning of the 20th century with the expanding economy. over time, suburbia became the dominant place where Americans lived. And a terrific book on this is by Dolores Hayden, one of the pieces that Eileen shared with me as we looked at it. And if you get a chance to look at that, it really is, she's very interesting in looking how populations have grown. So that's where most people have been living for the 20th and 21st century. It also is the largest asset class in the United States, comprising both residential and commercial enterprises and housing. So suburbia really matters as you look at this report. But as we know, for decades and decades, and you heard this in the earlier lectures, when we're talking about the American dream and we're talking about home ownership, we're talking about white Americans. That was the typical real estate customer for decades and decades. And as you look at this report, you'll begin to get a deeper sense of maybe what that means today. You may be aware that this past fall that the Boston Globe did a whole series on the housing crisis and focused on really Boston and the metro area in terms of the fact that there isn't a large housing inventory, that many people can't live where they want to live, and that what people are looking for is quite different than maybe what they were looking for 50 years ago. It's an interesting series. If you have the opportunity, you might want to take a look at it, and you might really, after hearing some of this, find that to be very relevant to where we are today. So what they were really looking at is the fading American dream. So when you think back to our series, it's called The American Dream, Suburbia, the American Dream, ? Think about that question mark as we move through this and as we move towards our theme, the evolving American dream. And these are some of the takeaways. I do want to recommend this report to you all. And why I do this is it's done in a way that is incredibly user-friendly. It's not overwhelmed with charts and graphs. They've been very mindful in what they've chosen. But what I find about each section, and we'll talk about the sections, in each one, they say at the end, why this matters. And their real audience here, it can be us as we read it, but they're looking at real estate developers and those people in the real estate industry at really paying attention to the deep research that they've done on these topics. But one of the first they came up with is that real estate is cyclical and subject to resets. And, you know, some of you are my age, and you know how the real estate market has changed in our lifetimes. When we bought our first house, interest rates were high, but we've seen them go up and down. We've seen housing prices, particularly when you live in this part of the world, really increase dramatically in many cases. So real estate tends to reset, but the Brookings report indicates that this reset here in the US has not happened in a long time as a result of the recession and also the crisis with subprime lending and all that happened quite some time ago. But instead, the real estate industry has just kind of continued to move along with no real resets, looking at various factors that are emerging in this country. And some of the major concerns are climate concerns. Our dogwood tree is going to bloom now. It used to bloom on Mother's Day. There are many, many examples that you all can think of how climate has changed more recently than we would have thought when we first heard about this. Also, the pandemic has been a real reset in terms of where people live, how they live, and where they work. Changing demographics, tremendous change. We now live in a country where in 1950, 90% of Americans were white. It's not true anymore. So it's important to look at how the world has changed. And in addition to that, where we are in terms of affordable housing. So these are some of the things that emerged. And their biggest concern is that the real estate market has not reset. And where is this American dream? And for many Americans, is it fading? And of course, this ties back to the work in the Boston Globe from last fall. So these are just some takeaways from the report. There's a lot in it. I've read it a lot, but every time I read it, I find something new to think about. So they, whoops. So they came up with 5 sets. I don't know why it's doing that. They're looking at 5 sets of trends that came out in terms of this report. The first one, separate and unequal. And I'm going to give you some of the highlights that came from that, but you know, we've talked about some of that just in this series, the concept of redlining that happened, that the jobs were available in construction only for white workers in the more well-paying opportunities that they had. So we're going to talk about that. The other one, we've mentioned a bit, the modernizing of the American family. Thirdly, the risky housing business, the office reimagined, and the retail revolution. So all of their research, which they published in December 2020, pointed to these 5 structural trends that they really believe are impacting what we build in America, who we are, and where we live. So the first, separate and unequal. And this section talks about the fact that residential segregation sustains racial and economic inequities geographically, constraining the American dream. It's a pretty powerful statement. First of all, most Americans live in racially segregated neighborhoods. Certainly true here, and it's true lots of places in America. In addition to that, they maintain that suburbanization, and now we get back to the suburb theme again, segregates neighborhoods by income. And one of the points they made that I thought was incredibly interesting is the concept of subdivisions. If you're in a small town or a city, houses are by block, one house, another house, another house, another house. But if you're in a subdivision, houses have large lots, and they tend to cost about the same thing from one home to another, making them exclusive to certain income groups and certainly certain racial groups as well, as we know historically happens. And I found that part very interesting as we talk about subdivisions, who lives there, who gets in and who doesn't. Quite different when you think about neighborhoods that could be integrated more easily when one house next to the other might not be as similar as the other one. I thought that was very interesting. And they also make a very strong statement that I think we all need to pay attention to, is that historically, the real estate industry and finance industry has exploited Black and brown populations. Redlining, well aware of that. Subprime loans, we all know what happened with that. And also lending practices that really weren't in best interest of buyers who were trying to perhaps live in other neighborhoods. One of the goals they talked about is, what are good neighborhoods as you think of separate and unequal? Well, good neighborhoods aren't scarce. They're available to everyone. They aren't expensive. And in addition to that, they are not exclusive, they are inclusive. And as we look forward into the 21st century, we want to think about what they're thinking about in those areas. One of the other pieces that was interesting is we've all heard of white flight. Well, interestingly, in their report, metro areas are actually becoming more diverse as younger people, millennials, are moving back into the city. And in addition to that, more Hispanic and Latino populations have settled in the city rather than suburbs. So white flight has beginning to reverse itself since around 2000. And what that's going to mean for where people live and also the context of the suburbs is quite interesting. So separate but unequal, interesting to think about as you look where we are and why this is one of the structural trends that's so important to bring out in this report. The other one, I'll turn to the next slide, is the one that I was going to focus on when we thought we were going to have Chris Marsh here. Chris, when Eileen and I had the opportunity to do a couple of Zoom meetings with her, which were great, and it is unfortunate she couldn't come, very dynamic, interesting person. And as a person of color, I really thought she was going to be someone talking much more about separate but unequal. But she was talking about what it is to be single. Single in this country where everything is family, family oriented. And she happens to live in Prince George's County, and you may be familiar with that. It's outside of DC and Baltimore. And it's actually the county with the highest per capita Black and Brown population in terms of income. And also, she does live in the suburbs there. And so she's made the point to us, is she said, there are a lot of things in my community that say, come to the park for a family event, or a neighborhood is having a family block party. And she said, it was eye-opening to me that America does not consider a single person a family, or part of a family. And her book, Love Jones Cohort, which I did go through, talks about what it is to be single, middle class, and Black in America. And there's actually a film from the late 90s called Love Jones. And Mike and I actually watched it, and it is eye-opening because it's middle class Black Americans and how they live. It was excellent and really eye-opening to realize how we are all so much looking for the same things in terms of where we work and who we are. So I thought modernizing the family was really where we were going to go if Chris was going to be here. So interesting to me. One of the main points is that the nuclear family is no longer the dominant household in the US. And if you grew up in the 50s and 60s with Leave It to Beaver and the Donna Reed show, Father Knows Best, families were mom, dad, and the kids. And everyone was from a first marriage family. And that's what everyone thought maybe America looked like. Well, that's not the way it is anymore. Over 50% of children in America do not live in households of a first marriage, two-parent family. A huge shift from the way things have been presented for so many years. Interestingly, 21% of Americans live in multi-general and mixed households. And they reside together for a number of reasons. Hopefully they like each other, but also on top of that, because this is a way to handle housing costs. And as we know, housing costs in this country have skyrocketed and made this American dream a very difficult one for people to attain. The other piece, and some of you may have lived this, we certainly have several times, that many single young adults tend to move back home. 21%. Why did they do that? College loans that they need to pay back. They can't afford, certainly, to move back here and buy us even a small starter home. So they're moving back home, and probably it's a pretty good lifestyle as well, and they can stay on the insurance till they're 25. The other piece, and some of you may know this, baby boomers aren't moving. They're staying in their big houses. And that's for a number of reasons. One of the pieces, and this came out in the Boston Globe report, there's no place to go. If you even look in this area on the South Shore, the number of places available to downsize are fairly limited. And as a result, 16.2%, according to this report, aren't going anywhere and are predominantly living in large single-family homes. And the other piece I thought was very interesting is the demand for single homes is declining in this country. In spite of that, the real estate industry is still building large single-family homes where people are looking more for condo, smaller condo, places that are more affordable, and maybe aren't so enamored by the large lawns that Ken Jackson talked about that is so unique to suburbia in the United States. One of the things that they talk about in this report is what has been happening with the real estate is that they've been trying to put a round peg into a square hole, that the housing that Americans need today isn't available to them. So modernizing family, very interesting, and I think one that is important for us all to pay attention to. And they call this risky housing business. And one of the concerns is that many properties in this country are being developed in places that are being most subject to climate change. And this is particularly in this report for families of low income. They tend to be built sometimes near toxic waste dumps. They may be built in floodplains. And one of the examples they gave was in California, people are moving far and far out from metropolitan areas to areas where they can afford to buy a home. And those are often areas that are very at risk from the wildfires that we hear about every single year during dry conditions. So the impact of climate has been a significant impact on housing, and this is why they brought it up. One of the things I read that I thought was most interesting was Miami. Miami Beach is considered to be the city and the area that is most at risk for sea level rising. And the prediction of this report, and I want to make sure I get it right, is by 2060. So it's a while down the road, but it'll be here in this century, that they anticipate that 58% of the habitable land that's there today will be gone due to flooding. And this will be disrupting housing for 30% of the population. So this issue of hurricanes, which we've seen devastating ones in the last 20 years, many of the things, these dramatic climate issues, more tornadoes, things like that, are often happening where new housing is being built and causing a lot of risk to people where they've been. So they maintain that areas are more impacted by climate change, and also it's impacting development patterns. A couple of things they talked about in terms of risky housing business too was this impact of, and we talk about it in the report, the commuting, the CO2 emissions in this country. The US is the second largest producer of CO2 emissions, and that we're not doing a whole lot about it. Federal policy, the way highways are being built, really is still assuming that people are going to be hopping into their cars and driving wherever they live into the city. One of the issues that's happened is that you really drive until you qualify if you're looking to buy a home, and that only impacts and accelerates climate change. So the risky housing business, important thing to look for. I did talk about the issue of single family homes not necessarily being what most younger Americans are often looking for. And the survey projects, and this is in working with Harvard and one of their areas that works on exploring housing and research, is they estimate that by 2038, 70% of Americans will live in areas that are walkable, where they can walk to common green areas, where they can walk to retail, where they can walk to school, walk to work. Currently, only 20% of Americans live in those communities, but that's where the prediction is as we begin to change. What is the American dream? What are we thinking about? Interesting part, risky housing business, and there's so much more to that report that you might find interesting if you get a chance to look at it. The office reimagined. This was already happening before the pandemic. People were beginning to work from home. Meetings were sometimes done by conference call, but the pandemic accelerated no longer having to drive into the office, but the idea of staying at home and being able to live just about anywhere to be able to do your job. The other thing that has happened with the office being reimagined is the idea that there have been knowledge sector areas, such as Silicon Valley, parts of 128, that have been cluster areas for where people live when they're doing specifically types of work, and it tends to be much more finance, technology, and innovation. So also major areas of the country where that's not happening. And that's had a real impact on what we build and where people live. The other piece, even though people are still going into the office, the need for major, large office buildings has declined greatly. And that's become an issue because now spaces are smaller, they're more collaborative. And I know of people who maybe are working for Amazon, office might be at the seaport, but they only have to go in 2 or 3 days a week. Where prior to the pandemic, everybody was driving in, everyone was doing it all the time. You needed a work area for everyone, and that's no longer the case. So one of the things as we look into the future is, what about these big office buildings? What do we do about them? One of the issues is in the report was really talking about the reuse of a lot of the things that have been built, and perhaps these will be some of the solutions as we look for different ways that American lives. They also talked about the impact on commercial tax revenues that happen when we no longer have large office buildings and need smaller ones. And also when you think about places even like where we've been shopping, many areas are vacant. And what do we do with those? And rethinking about what we do. One of the things they mentioned that I thought was really interesting, and you think about it, if you go to South Shore Plaza or Derby Street, there still are businesses there. It doesn't look like it used to. And you do see vacancies, but what they have found is that many of these larger places, such as the bigger box places, could take the example of Target, have actually begun to downsize and have found that they're more effective if they have a smaller brick and mortar space that we all can see and go to, but also have a large online opportunity as well. And one that came out in the report, and I thought it was so interesting because it's Warby Parker, which happens to be at Derby Street. It's quite small, but Warby Parker was 100% online and found they were much more effective if they had a physical presence that coupled with their online opportunities. So I don't think, based on the report, we're going to see a complete disappearance of retail and those kind of office spaces, but I thought it was very interesting. So the last piece is the retail revolution. And I think we all know it. On my way here this afternoon, I was behind 2 large Amazon trucks. I was hoping that one was headed to my house because I just ordered something last night at 6 o'clock and it's supposed to show up today. So we all do it and it works, but it certainly has changed. And look at what happened with the pandemic. All you needed to do was walk outside and see delivery trucks everywhere. So this is where the whole piece of thinking about places like Warby Parker, Target, the malls, how does that change? How does that change how we shop, what we do? When do we actually need to go and look at something, and when is online going to work? And it's a complete change in retail. They also talked about the issue of how we've seen so many companies shift from being neighborhood operations. And think of I love independent booksellers. And going to Buttonwood Books is a real something important to me because I can't stand to see the thought of those places going away. But we're seeing that happen. I think of Walsh and Packard that used to be right over there, that lovely neighborhood feel of going there is part of the retail revolution, things that are changing. We have Lowe's, get the same things there, but it's a different sense of community and what we're looking at. So one of the big concerns now are all of the shopping malls. And we can all remember, I think when shopping malls first came in, I remember first going to the first indoor mall. I think I was 16, it was for my 16th birthday. And I don't even want to go to them anymore, but that was such an important thing. And now many of them are vacant. And this is being looked at in these reports. How do we refurbish them? What do we do? Will this help us address where we live and what we build? One of the things that came out in spite of retail is the issue of it being walkable. And number 2, and this really goes back to separate and unequal, the issue that retail in Black and brown neighborhoods isn't the same as it is in white neighborhoods. And often it's what they've referred to as really predatory retailers, lots of loan places, pawn shops, but no grocery stores. So I think it's important for us to think as we try to move forward to an evolving American dream, what does that mean for all Americans? And I think it heightens our own awareness living here and how we have such a plethora of places to be able to do that. So walkable retail, a big issue. Retail being available to all Americans is something that they brought up. And the idea that it really is changing. And I think it's something that we're all very aware of. And how does it impact the suburbs? I mean, right now, Carol Ann's vacant across the street. I don't like this part of Hingham looking like that. We need to figure out what kind of retail do we need and what do our communities need as well. So this is the positive part. So you take a look at the 5 themes. the fact that so much time was taken to put this report together, to really think about who we are and where we're going. So what are we looking for? What is the evolving American dream? Affordable, safe housing. We want that for everyone. Proximity to employment, being able to get to work either by energy efficient public transportation, but no longer putting tremendous amount of emissions into the air that really are only damaging our climate in the future. Walkable and accessible to this good transportation. And so importantly to me as an educator, high quality and equitable public education for everybody. It doesn't happen, but it's should be our evolving American dream, and also accessibility to food and to shopping. One of the pieces, and I didn't mention it, was that we're very fortunate here. We can get to good food and great shopping in 5 minutes. But that's not true for all Americans. And many times things are built out in a more higher income area where people in lower income areas have to travel out to be able to go to, say, a Stop and Shop or something such as that and be able to use it. So I'm going to end by saying this is a wonderful report, and Eileen's got even more to tell you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth, and really helpful to guide us through that report and expose us to it, because there's a lot of learning to come from that. And really related to some of what you've already heard from Ruth, let's talk about some key takeaways from Ellen Dunham Jones. So she was really focused on what's happening with retrofitting suburbia. We talked about shopping malls being abandoned and what the future is for them. Well, Ellen spent a lot of time talking about that, but she began by describing what the post-war suburban form was. And she said, you know, this is a form that isn't necessarily always in what's thought of as a suburb. It may actually be within the city boundaries, but what it is basically, if you look at it graphically, it's boxes surrounded by flattish space that's either lawn or parking lots. And she contrasted that with the urban form, which is more buildings close to a sidewalk and parking either underneath or behind. She said the suburban form has streets that are tree-like networks, trunks and twigs, and basically the only way to get around efficiently is by car, also contrasted with the urban form. And then she talked about how post-war suburbs with this design are aging, but in particular, kind of the first, like the canary in the coal mine, the first thing to go are these shopping malls and office parks that are having trouble maintaining their earlier economic viability. But she said, in addition to that, when you think about especially post-war suburbs, they are starting to need infrastructure refitting or replacement. Roads, pipes, and wires need replacement. So it's not just the shopping centers that need attention. So these six urgent challenges that she went through reminded me a lot of what Gordon Carr had talked about what people were looking for in the master plan, the citizen input. Disrupting automobile dependence, improving public health, supporting an aging population, leveraging social capital for equity. We talked about more diversity, competing for jobs. This is where we want businesses to locate, you know, in all of our communities. And so we're in competition. And then climate change and water and energy resiliency. So very similar to what we've been hearing in earlier lectures. And then there were so many wonderful examples she gave, and many, many more in the book that she co-authored. But it was interesting to hear that one of the early examples that they chose to look at was Mashpee Commons on Cape Cod, where you had an aging mall that was converted to a mixed-use community. And it was interesting to hear how they had to kind of skirt around the zoning regulation. She said they sort of pretended that the streets that they were drawing weren't streets, the way they presented the plan, in order to get around the zoning restrictions that existed then. But the build out that they did was very, very well received, so much so that they wanted to expand, but the community is not in favor of that. So Mashpee Commons is unable to grow the way they had originally planned, but an early success of a retrofit. And then she talked about a community in Lakewood, Colorado, Belmore, where again, an aging mall was redeveloped, in this case, to become a dining, shopping, and arts district. And then she gave many other examples of these kinds of retrofits, often malls or office parks. But then she gave interesting examples of a road diet, for example. And we're looking to do one of those here in Hingham. In this case, a road diet that improved safety and revitalized a shopping center, where it used to be really challenging to get in and out even. But now they had bike paths and it was more pedestrian friendly. And then a commercial office park that actually gained value, became a more popular place for people to rent space because they added walking and biking trails, because younger people in particular who worked there wanted to stay healthy and didn't want to have to get in their car to go out for lunch. They wanted to take a walk. So she gives a lot of interesting examples that fit with what we were hearing from Ruth. We then heard from Larry Levy, and I heard really unexpected things from Larry Levy. I knew he was going to talk about suburbs and national politics, and here we are in 2024 where that matters. Well, he underscored something we heard before, that most people in America, well, 52% of Americans live in suburbs, therefore they obviously matter because of the size of the population. But then he said, not only do they impact the presidency, but that in this current round of the elections coming up, only 30 to 40 of the congressional districts are really competitive, where you don't know it's going to go Democrat or Republican, of the 435 in Congress. And he said all of those 30 to 40 are wholly or substantially suburban. So the point he made was suburbs are not only going to control who's in the White House, but who has the gavel in Congress. So enormous political power that the suburbs have. And then he talked about how suburbs are evolving politically, because when suburbs, the way suburb he grew up in, the suburb I grew up in, tended to be Eisenhower Republican suburbs. The people who lived in the suburbs were generally voting Republican. But now there's more socioeconomic and ethnic and racial diversity, not in every suburb, but many, many suburbs around the country, much more diverse than they were. And these are people who are bringing their a little bit more centrist values into the suburbs. And sometimes left of center. But he said, and he actually gave a personal experience of when he and his wife were looking for where to move. He said there's this big sort, and it wasn't his term, but he explained what he meant. It's created ideological islands. People want to live among like-minded voters. And so you'll see differences between suburbs because people are kind of clicking together. But that there's similarities across suburbs. And this one really stuck with me. He said suburbs by their nature are optimistic places. And he said that because basically we make big investments in our homes and properties. And we make big investments in the future because our property tax is fueling education for the future. And I had never thought of suburbs in that way, that they are just inherently optimistic. People are betting on the future. And then he said people vote based on value, the value of their real estate, but also on values or quality of life, as well as social safety net. And for those of you who were at town meeting this week, the discussion about the property where we have a woodworker, a furniture maker in our town, that to me, there was a lot of discussion about why the town looks at properties that they might sell, and that affects our value, part of it, how much taxes are we going to pay? How does the town put more money into the capital account to pay for things we have to build? But then there were all these people who stood up to talk about the character of our town and our history, who talked about our woodworking history and the importance of the arts. And it really, to me, hit home that yes, there's value of real estate as well as values at play here. And town meeting is a great place to see that. But he underscored that suburban voters, by and large, don't like extremes. They're centrist, and they just don't want uncertainty and chaos. They don't like either political extreme, and that affects how our politicians present themselves to suburban voters. So with that, I'm going to ask Ruth to join me up here, and we're going to have a very short conversation and then open it to your questions. Thank you all for your attention.
Yep.
So Ruth, first of all, it's been a real pleasure to work with Ruth on thinking about how we would present this information to you today. But what really struck you, Ruth, as you first looked at this great real estate reset report? Was there something that just surprised you totally?
I think I was most surprised by just I think maybe even that the whole issue of suburbia began in the 19th century. I did not grow up in the suburbs. I grew up in a small rural town in Pennsylvania. So I had never much thought about that, but I found that very interesting. And having lived in Massachusetts now for over 30 years, I loved learning about how all of these communities developed and eventually became suburbia. Very interesting to me.
And then as you looked at this data from, that you poured over, did that change how you thought about suburbs?
Oh, absolutely. I think, yeah, the whole issue, I think, of diversity, where people live, the fact that the demographics have so changed in this country that we get very stagnant notions of who we are as a country and where people live, and that really those are very disabused by a report like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add before we open it to the floor here? Because I really want to hear what's on people's minds as they just start to digest some of what they've heard. And I will say, there was a lot of information that I hadn't remembered as vividly as when I went back and looked at the recordings of all these programs. So some of that may be fresh to you, but I'm curious what might stand out to you. And we're going to hand these microphones to Max for the audience here and to Judith for our Zoom audience, so we can hear from you. And then Ruth and I will share this microphone if you have questions.
All right. Any questions from the audience in the house?
Or comments or observations, overview, what your impression is from, for those of you who have seen several lectures in the series, anything that hit home for you or that you found surprising or interesting. Got one, Becky?
Just a follow-up on your recent comment about having reviewed the recordings of the presentations. People should know that those are available online to the general public. And if maybe you could just say how they could find them.
Yeah, so if you subscribe to the series, those links have been sent out. What we always do with our lecture series, and part of this is to honor those who allow us to do this by subscribing, we give all the raw Zoom recordings to Harbor Media, which I'll be doing this week, so that they can prepare it to air not only on their cable access channels, but on their online YouTube channel. And they also give the files back to us when they're finished up. So they edit them so that you don't have a delay in the beginning, or if there are any glitches, they take those out. They, make them look like finished produced programs. And then they give the files back to us so we can put them on our YouTube channel. So as I said, if you've subscribed, you've gotten the links, and we can probably resend all the links to all the audience that's subscribed. But starting in the fall, they will be available both through Harbor Media's YouTube channel, the cable access channels, and then on the Society YouTube page as well.
Anybody else have some comments, questions?
I found the whole overarching presentation very, very enriching. Having grown up in a small Massachusetts town, 1706, moving to Pittsburgh, big city, for college, moving to the Midwest to a town that thought it was pretty old, that was 1836, and then back here. So much of this seems to make a lot more sense. In most all those places, you didn't think about how your town came to be or your city and its relation to the surrounding area. You know, some places grew up because they had, well, the town in Michigan grew up because they had 3 water sources and they could have mills, tons of mills. Then the trains came because they wanted to service those mills. Well, then how did that connect to Detroit, which was our cultural center? It's been so informative. I really thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for that observation. And certainly my experience, I grew up in Englewood, New Jersey, part of Bergen County, a suburban county of New Jersey that people mostly commuted to Manhattan for work. But it was a city. It had diversity, but definitely, you know, redlined. And I never thought about, you know, what our relationship was to other suburbs or to the city. I knew my dad took the bus to work, but I didn't think about it. And then I came up to Hingham, very different type of suburb. And I felt more like I was living in a suburb because it, you know, wasn't a city the way Englewood was, but never put these pieces together that America is a suburban nation. I mean, that when I first read Ken's book, it really jumped out at me that the rest of the world looked at us as kind of interesting. Oh, look at these shopping malls and, you know, drive-in movie theaters for that matter, back in the 50s. All these things that characterized America. And, you know, our culture spread through shopping malls. You know, suddenly everyone knew what a bagel was or a croissant or something. You know, it enabled the spread of culture. So there were interesting positives about it, but I never thought of it as a defining characteristic of America. So that's one of the things that hit me.
Do we have any questions or comments from Zoom?
We do have a question on Zoom. This series has been fascinating, but perhaps because I'm a minister, I'm curious if there's been any research about the role of churches in the development of suburbia or vice versa, especially in New England. Hingham, which began with one church, now has at least 12, half of them built in the 20th century. Do you know of any studies or ideas about that?
I know of no studies or ideas, but the one thing I know something about relative to Hingham is that when the Irish first came to Hingham, there was no Catholic church here. Catholics were really, the church kind of organized regionally, and they'd have visiting ministers come to someone's home, or in some cases town hall actually, to do their services. And so the Irish were responsible when they grew in numbers for creating the process of what led to St. Paul's Church first. But then when the Italians came, they didn't feel welcome in that church, and they were still going into Boston for their services. So some of this is just driven, I think, organically by the population that comes and what they're looking for, and then people form their own identities around their religion and create new institutions. But I know of no studies. I think that a good place to look for something like that, which is often where we started for the lecture series, there's something called JSTOR, JSTOR, and you can subscribe to that for like a month. You don't have to subscribe for a year. And if you're looking for something very specific, and often if I was working on a blog or something, I would just subscribe for a month, and you go in by keywords, and you can find all kinds of academic research that's been done. And you'll have rights to download that during that period. So that's something I'd recommend in terms of looking for any research that's been done.
Not exactly sure this pertains to our series, but it's something that concerns me and I think about daily. You mentioned that we are the only country that's each community sets their own education system. And in Europe and so forth, everybody studies exactly the same thing. Well, we are a democracy, and our forefathers did say that it was very important in a democracy to have an educated public. And I feel now very much that things are happening that show we do not have an educated populace in terms of government. We don't teach civics in the high school like we used to. I don't think there are students that learn what is in the Constitution. There are 14 states right now that legislatures are deciding whether they're going to have a Christian minister be part of every public school in their town. They obviously didn't get the message in the 1700s that we divided church and state. The MCASs are in English, math, and science. We seem to have put history out to lunch. And I'm wondering how we, in this area where in a country and in these suburbs where we do develop our own education. I'm not saying I think we have a bad school system in Hingham or anything like that. I'm saying we're not thinking of our democracy when we're developing our education today. And it terrifies me, to be really truthful with you.
Yeah, I certainly feel that. Ruth, you wanted to comment? on
I
that?
do. I think that's a whole lecture series, Jane, to begin with. But secondly, I'm going to give you some hope. The revised Massachusetts curriculums frameworks for history and social studies, revised around 2018, 2019, has a requirement in civics in 8th grade, as well as the high school in Massachusetts, and students are required to have, they can either do individual or group projects that must be civic related. So that's a step in that direction of what you're looking at. I think one of the biggest challenges, I mean, Massachusetts is predominantly either local school districts with local control or regional school districts, and then you have the gateway cities. Other parts of the country have county school systems. It is different from one place to another, and I think it breeds inequity. And in Massachusetts, it's all property taxes. And we've done a lot with diversity, equity, inclusion in the work that I do as a consultant and working in districts. And it is all over the place because of political views, but also because of socioeconomic availability of resources. And it's a whole area that just needs to be looked at and thought about. We were on the road to having Common Core curriculum for the country, and it was blown out of the water by local control. I will say I do think the standards for Massachusetts are outstanding and they're excellent. You can find them online, and they are revised to be much more inclusive, helping our students learn about government and civics. But that's not true in all 50 states. But thank you for bringing it up, because I think it's incredibly important. And one of the concerns I do have is what you said with statewide testing, because if you value it, they will pay for it. And as a result of that, I am aware of colleagues who have downplayed the study of history and social studies in their budgets and in their districts because it's not tested. As an administrator, I fought against that up one side and down the other. If you don't, you learn history, you will repeat it. And we worked hard to keep it in Whitman-Hanson where I was, but there's a lot of push because it's not tested. So you bring up a very valid point of something I think we can lobby for, much more of an understanding of how valuable history and social studies are to our students if they're going to be informed Americans. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you, Ruth, for your expertise on that question.
Fired up about it.
Yeah. So two things I just said. One, Larry Levy talked about the big sort. And so when you talk about all these decisions being made locally and people are only living with like-minded people, you'll see these wide differences. But one other little bright spot, it's a tiny little thing, but last year, for the first time, a former elementary grade school teacher, Bev Vernon here in Hingham, got a grant for the third graders to be exposed to their very own town meeting and to come up with their own warrant articles and to proceed to have a real town meeting. You know, we had to make sure we didn't call it town meeting. We had to say, you know, pretend town meeting or something. But they went to the old Ship Meeting House where town meeting used to happen. And every third grader stood up and either spoke for or against a warrant article. And they were precious warrant articles, as you can imagine. But and some of the kids were more likely to stand up in groups than on their own. But every single third grader spoke. And it was wonderful to see the process because not every warrant article passed. And some of them were arguing because they knew a little bit about how their parents vote. And they were talking about, but our taxes will go up if we do this, you know. So some of them had kind of adult minds about it. And some of them were, you know, we think there should be a comfort animal in all schools because children have bad days. You know, some were very touching. So there was that value and values thing going on. And that was such a wonderful way to teach civics at that level where they're not afraid to stand up. They haven't gotten so embarrassed about, you know, what they may look like to their peers or something. And I was really encouraged that there could be things like that are part of the civics curriculum that at an early age, children understand that they can make decisions that affect their communities. So small thing, but was big to me, touched my heart.
I just wanted to say that I really appreciate kind of the intimate look at suburbs because I was born and lived my first years in a suburb of St. Louis, and then I lived in a suburb of Los Angeles, and now living in a suburb of Boston. I tended to think of suburbs as being sort of like, if you look at the map of the US, targets everywhere, you know, where you have the hub, which is the bullseye, and then you have the rims coming out of the suburb. But to find out the similarities and how things apply from the standpoint of education and the standpoint of race was really meaningful to me. It had me thinking too about times I've traveled overseas and how different it is, like when you visit London or you know, other towns that you visit, Rome. It's a totally different picture somehow, and to see how America made it unique in some ways was really fascinating. So
Okay.
I just thank you for doing that.
One thing, Ken Jackson did say that there are parts of the world where they're starting to look a little bit more like America. I think Australia was one place he mentioned, and I'm not sure, it might have been France, where you are starting to see the type of suburbs that we developed, but it took a long time for that to be replicated.
Question from Zoom?
We have a comment, two comments that say, thank you for another wonderful lecture series. And a question, I wonder in your research if you had any insight into how the influence of a suburban lifestyle had on the attitudes and role of women.
Yeah, well, Dolores Hayden, her book, and I'm not sure if it's Hayden or Hayden, but in her book, she does talk specifically about suburbs and women, more so as, you know, as a big theme in her book than Ken Jackson did. But I think a lot of factors have impacted how women view where they live and how they live. So I can't think of any of the speakers in this program that spent a lot of time on it. But the fact that women work out of the home, you know, most women work outside of the home, even with young children, certainly is a difference from the way post-war suburbs were developed, where they expected mom would be the homemaker and would get the kids to school and would get the groceries and things. And then, you know, dad would drive back home. So the world has changed quite a bit. And what Ruth shared with us about the typical American household. And, you know, so many households are headed by women where there's no spouse and there's children, and those women are juggling everything. So the world has changed a lot. I'm not sure that suburbs changed women, but women have changed suburbs.
Thank you. We do have one more question. The recent town meeting demonstrated that only 1% of the citizens can control what the town does and how it spends its money. This is turning Hingham into a place for only the wealthy where unlimited funds are spent on schools for a small number of children. Is there any way to keep this from happening and where senior citizens can still afford to live here?
I can't speak for town government. I do wish more people came to town meeting. Because, and this is true everywhere. Some people say, well, we should just decide things at the polls, but we have a lot of complex issues to deal with as the legislature for the town. And it's a shame to just see a few hundred people show up. Everyone who's a registered voter is eligible to show up and make a difference in the future of our town. And I do hope that as many people as possible show up on Monday for the third and final night of town meeting this year. We'll want a quorum by 7 p.m. Very important.
Oh,
Thank you so much for this day and the series. And I'm not sure how to express this question, but it's been happening in my brain a lot about the role of how urban centers, cities developed and how it has impacted what happens to suburbia. And I'm thinking of the cities that I frequent and have relatives. First, Washington, D.C., where it was planned that there would be neighborhoods of business and community life and then housing. And then Atlanta and Denver. And Atlanta has, a subway system, but they have no transportation or little transportation that works for low-income people to get to workplaces. So there's that inequity that happens there. Denver is trying to be better with public transportation, but it's very much developed around the car. In DC, transportation has just a whole different picture. But I guess that's sort of a larger picture of how we live in this community, in this nation of ours, and how it impacts the suburban environments that we live in.
Yeah, and certainly Washington was a planned city. Atlanta invested a lot of money in mass transit for the Olympics. But it's, we see that here in Boston, that mass transit doesn't always get the investment that it needs to stay functional. We have a very old mass transit system here, not as old as Atlanta, but Washington, D.C., I know has spent a lot of money on mass transit, and that's not working as well as it used to. So it's choices that cities make, where the investment goes, make a big difference in people being able to get around. And you're right, equity is part of that. If you don't have mass transit, it's harder for people at lower income strata to get to work, get their kids to school, all of that.
all righty.
Thank you all for your attention, for your interesting comments and questions. It's just been a real pleasure to put this series together.
And Judith and Jane, if you wouldn't mind coming to the front as well.
So as our education committee is coming forward, I'm going to put on my education manager cap and quiz you guys like I do with the students we get here at the Hingham Historical Society. If America's the first suburban nation, what's the second? Yes, Canada. We can't leave the Canadians out of the comments. Also a suburban nation. I think maybe the only other one. But in urban planning circles, we often get lumped together because our cities are so similar. So something to think about. But come on up, come on up, come on up. So we're going to round out, we're going to wind down our lecture series today right now. And I have a couple things I'm going to say. And I'm going to conclude this with very exciting news. So thank you for being patient and bearing with us. So that was a wonderful lecture. I want to thank Eileen and Ruth I really especially want to thank Eileen McIntyre so much for putting this entire lecture series together. She's worked tirelessly to organize the speakers, to build the schedule, provide feedback on marketing, and she's showing up one Sunday a month and so much more. This could not have happened without her, and the Hingham Historical Society is so thankful for your work, Eileen. You're an inspiration to me, and you have been such a good mentor as I work to build next year's lecture series. The amount of work pulling off something like this, it's a lot, and it's astounding. And it's a testament to her work ethic and her talent. So thank you so much, Eileen, truly. I also would very much like to thank the wonderful Hingham Historical Society, very talented education committee, which includes Eileen, of course, and Ruth Gilbert-Whitner, and Jane Shute. Sorry, I'm gonna have to slow down as Deirdre hands them there. And Jane Shute. And of course, Judith Brooks. The education committee here at the Hingham Historical Society is composed solely of generous people who volunteer their time and expertise to advise us on programs, especially this lecture series. Our volunteers, especially ones that step up to the plate and join a big committee like this, really make this place run. And it's awesome, the job they do. I get the pleasure of sitting down with these four basically once a month and hearing them share their thoughts. And they teach me things I'm very thankful to know. So a big round of applause and thank you so much for our education committee. And lastly, yeah, you can sit down. I release you. And lastly, I want to thank our tech support, master of all things Zoom, audio, TV, computers, Colin McGinnis, the man behind the curtain. Colin shows up for all these lectures. Thank you, Colin. Thank you. He shows up for all these lectures, and he also shows up every Friday before each lecture to make sure that everything's good and everything's working out on our end. And he always has Dunkin', so we got him a Dunkin' gift card. So thank you so much, Colin. And I also want to give a shout out to Dorothy Gallo, a great and tireless friend of the Hingham Historical Society, who is Zooming in from the hospital. And that's the level of support we get from Dorothy. And we love having people like Dorothy as members and supporters and board members as part of the Hingham Historical Society. And so now Deirdre's spoiling my surprise. She's spoiling my surprise. No one saw that. I want to announce the moment you've all been waiting for. Starting in September, the Hingham Historical Society will begin its 2024-2025 lecture series. Any guesses on what it's going to be about? It's called Revisiting the American Revolution. And as you all likely know, we're commemorating the 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War here at the Hingham Historical Society. Started last year and it's going to continue all the way through. We can go till 2033. It was a long war. And this is part of our commemorative effort. The 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War is a great time to revisit this topic. And as you know, if you've attended some of our events, you know that Hingham played a crucial role in the American Revolution through the hundreds of local patriots that served, who Ellen, our wonderful volunteer, has been researching, and the contributions of people like General Benjamin Lincoln, the Hingham sailors who served on the high seas, and even the bucket makers who made things like canteens. So much more. And I've noticed, through working here and talking about the Revolutionary War a lot, now this is a topic that people really, I know that. I know all about that. Yeah, okay. No, don't need to tell me more. But I think it's a topic that people really know the fairy tale version of, and they kind of miss the real, raw, gritty, true history. That's very fascinating and very complex. And so we've recruited 7 speakers who are all experts on various aspects of this conflict. And they're going to shed new perspectives on, again, what might seem a well-worn topic. So there's really no better way to observe Rev 250 than to join us for this lecture series on our nation's founding struggle in an in-depth way. And we're offering a special promotional offer to all of you here. If you register for revisiting the American Revolution by July 1st, you will get a free book of your choosing from the list that Deirdre is handing out. These include books from Suburbia, The American Dream, and they include books that we will be talking about during Revisiting the American Revolution. So this is a great time, especially thinking about how nice the weather is, to get that summer beach reading in, right? Registration ticketing is available on our website right now as of 2:30 today. So join us for that by July 1st, and you'll get to pick one of those free books. And we're super excited about that. So thanks everybody for joining us. It's been a wonderful, great lecture series. Thank you all for joining us and taking the time to join us on a beautiful day. And please join us downstairs for light refreshments. Thank you so much.